She dismissed him in front of 42 employees, 2 board members, and a floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the whole city. Diane Calloway had her head of security escort a man out of the Meridian hospitality lobby like he was a stranger who'd wandered in off the street. She didn't ask his name. She didn't look twice. He was wearing a worn flannel shirt and carrying a gas station coffee cup, and when the security guard touched his arm, the man just smiled, which should have told her everything. It didn't. 81 minutes later, her phone rang. The $340 million acquisition she'd spent 7 months building collapsed in a single call, and the man they'd walked out through the revolving doors, he was the one who could have saved it. The morning had started the way the dangerous ones always do. Ordinary, unremarkable. Dressed up to look like any other Tuesday, Diane Calloway woke at 5:50 to an alarm she didn't need because she hadn't really slept. She lay in the dark of her apartment on the 22nd floor, listening to the city find its early rhythm, and thought about the number that had lived in her chest for the past 4 months like something with weight. $340 million. She'd said it so many times in conference rooms and finance meetings and late-night calls with her CFO that it had stopped feeling like money. It had started feeling like a verdict. She was 41 years old and had been running Meridian Hospitality for 6 years. She'd taken the CEO chair the way most women took CEO chairs in industries that weren't built for them, by being twice as prepared and half as loud, and by outlasting everyone who assumed she wouldn't. The company was her father's, technically. He'd built it from a single roadside inn in rural Tennessee into a mid-sized portfolio of boutique hotels across the Southeast. He'd handed her the keys when his health started slipping, and she'd spent the years since proving that the handoff wasn't a mistake. The Harlow Group acquisition was supposed to be the thing that made that proof permanent. Harlow owned 7 luxury properties in Markets Meridian, had been trying to enter for years. Coastal Carolina, the Virginia wine country corridor, a gem of a resort outside Asheville. Adding them would nearly double Meridian's footprint and put the company on a different tier entirely. Her CFO, Bernard Leake, had called it transformational. Her chairman had called it overdue. Even the bank had been enthusiastic, and banks were rarely enthusiastic. She got out of bed and made coffee at the stove the way she always did, standing at the window while it brewed, watching the city below decide what it wanted to be today. The seller was a man named Seth Crandall. She knew the broad strokes. Third-generation hospitality family, private, quiet reputation, built the Harlow properties himself over 15 years without ever taking outside investment. The financial press barely knew he existed. His name showed up in regional business journals and almost nowhere else. He had declined every acquisition offer for the past decade, which made the fact that he'd agreed to a conversation with Meridian feel like something close to luck. Her chairman, Philip Greer, had brokered the introduction. He'd been ebullient about it at dinner 2 months ago, leaning across the table at the kind of restaurant that had linen napkins folded into birds. "This is the one," he'd said. "This is what puts Meridian on the map." She'd believed him. By 7:15 she was at her desk, and by 9 she was in the small conference room with Bernard and her acquisitions director and 2 members of her legal team, running through the presentation she'd spent 3 weeks refining. The numbers were clean, the narrative was tight, the synergy case was genuine, not the assembled in PowerPoint kind, but the kind that came from actually understanding both portfolios. "You're ready," Bernard said when they finished. She nodded. What she didn't say was that she'd been ready for 2 months and was tired of being ready and needed this to be done. The lobby of Meridian Hospitality occupied the entire ground floor of a restored warehouse building in the Arts District. Exposed brick, 14-foot ceilings, a reception desk made from reclaimed wood from one of her father's original properties. She'd fought the board for that detail. They'd wanted marble. She'd wanted something that remembered where the company came from. She'd won, which was the pattern of her tenure. Small fights that told you something about the larger ones. At 9:40, she rode the elevator down to meet Seth Crandall's arrival. She was talking to Bernard near the reception desk when the lobby doors opened. The man who walked in was maybe 52, medium height. He was wearing dark jeans and a flannel shirt in a faded blue plaid, the kind that had been washed so many times it had softened into something that fit like a second skin. He was holding a paper coffee cup from the gas station 2 blocks down. She recognized the logo, and he was looking at the lobby ceiling with the expression of someone who appreciated old buildings. He didn't look at her. Her assistant, a sharp 26-year-old named Tyler, was already moving toward him. Tyler had been briefed on the guest list. Seth Crandall's office had confirmed 2 attendees, a transaction attorney named Miriam Oakes and Mr. Crandall himself. The confirmation had included a brief bio and no photograph. "Excuse me," Tyler said, appearing at the man's elbow with the particular confidence of someone doing their job. "Can I help you?" The man looked at him. He had an unhurried face, not unfriendly, the kind of face that had spent a lot of time outdoors or in rooms where things were decided without theater. "Just waiting on someone," he said. "This is a private event this morning." Tyler's voice stayed professional. "Do you have an appointment?" Something shifted at the corner of the man's mouth. Not offense, more like confirmation of something he'd already suspected. "I do," he said. Tyler glanced at his tablet. "Your name?" Before the man could answer, Diane was already moving. Not because she'd read the situation, she hadn't. She was moving because the time was 9:53 and Seth Crandall's team was expected at 10 and she didn't have room in this morning for something unscheduled. She crossed the lobby. She looked at the man in the flannel shirt with the gas station coffee, and she made the assessment that rooms like hers trained people to make, quickly and without examining it. "Sir," she said, and she heard herself using her operations voice, the one she deployed for contractor disputes and vendor overruns. "I'm afraid we have the building reserved this morning for a private meeting. If you're here for something else, Tyler can help you find the right contact." The man looked at her for a moment. His eyes were dark and calm. He didn't seem flustered. He didn't seem embarrassed. He seemed, if anything, mildly interested in what she would do next. "I'm here for the 10 o'clock, he said. She heard the lobby doors open again behind her. A woman came in, late 40s, charcoal blazer, leather portfolio, the composed bearing of someone who billed by the quarter hour. Diane glanced at her and back at the man. Philip Greer's voice came from across the lobby. He'd arrived without her noticing, which was one of his habits. He was looking at Tyler. Handle it. And Tyler, 26 years old, 2 months in his role, did exactly what he'd been implicitly told to do. He put a gentle hand on the man's arm. "Sir, if you want to wait in the courtyard area, I can have someone come down and sort out the mix-up." The man looked at Tyler's hand. He looked at Diane. She was already looking at Philip, who was gesturing toward the elevator bank. She turned away. She heard the lobby doors open and close. She didn't look back. The woman with the leather portfolio, Miriam Oakes, it turned out, had come to stand near the reception desk. She was looking at the doors. Her expression was the expression of someone watching something break and calculating whether to say so. "Ms. Oakes," Diane said, extending a hand, "thank you for coming. We're ready upstairs." Miriam Oakes looked at her for a long moment before she took the handshake. She had the eyes of someone who said what she meant and had learned to pause before saying it. "Mr. Crandall prefers to arrive separately," Miriam said. Her voice was measured. "He'll be up shortly." Diane smiled and gestured toward the elevator. In the conference room, she presented. She was good at presenting. She'd been doing it for 20 years, in rooms that ranged from enthusiastic to openly hostile, and she'd learned to separate her performance from her internal state completely. She walked through the acquisition rationale. She walked through the numbers. She answered the 2 questions Miriam Oakes asked with clarity and precision. Seth Crandall's chair sat empty at the corner of the table. No one mentioned it directly. That was how these rooms worked. You arranged yourself around the thing nobody was naming and talked about everything else until someone had to. At 10:48, her phone buzzed under the table. She left it. At 10:51, it buzzed again. At 10:54, Tyler opened the conference room door and caught her eye with a look she recognized immediately. The look that meant now. She wrapped the presentation in 90 seconds of closing remarks and called a 5-minute break. Tyler was waiting in the hallway holding his phone, the way people held things that were about to change something. "This came in at 10:37, he said. "I didn't want to interrupt." She took the phone. The email was from Seth Crandall's personal address. It was 3 sentences. It said that he was withdrawing from all discussions regarding the Harlow Group properties. It said the decision was final. It said he wished Meridian success. She read it twice. Standing in the hallway in her heels, with the city behind the glass and 42 people on the other side of a conference room door waiting for her to come back in. "Tyler," she said. "Yeah, what does Seth Crandall look like?" Tyler looked at her. He didn't answer right away, which was its own answer. He pulled up a page on his phone and handed it to her. The photograph was from a regional business journal profile. A man standing outside a stone building, squinting slightly into the sun. Flannel shirt, dark eyes, unhurried face. She handed the phone back. She stood in the hallway for a moment. Outside, the city was doing what cities did. Moving. Indifferent. "I need 4 minutes," she said. She went to the restroom at the end of the hall and ran cold water over her wrists. She looked at herself in the mirror. She had spent 7 months building this. She had restructured the offer twice, brought in new advisors, flown to Charleston on 48 hours' notice to tour properties she wasn't even sure he'd sell. and she had stood in her own lobby and looked at the man who held all of it in his hands and decided, in the space of 12 seconds without asking his name, that he didn't belong in her building. The face in the mirror didn't have a lot to offer. She dried her hands. She went back into the conference room and ended the meeting cleanly, thanked everyone for their time, said her office would be in touch. She said it evenly. She didn't explain. After the room cleared, she sat at the empty table for 7 minutes. Philip came back in eventually. He settled into a chair across from her with the practiced concern of someone who had performed this particular expression many times. "What happened?" he said. "We lost the Harlow deal." "How?" His eyebrows went up. Crandall withdrew, effective immediately. Philip shook his head slowly. He made a sound that was meant to communicate disbelief. "That's extraordinary. Did something go wrong in the presentation?" "The presentation was fine. Then what could possibly I need to think?" She looked at him. "I'll let you know." He nodded gravely. He patted the table twice. "We'll find another path," he said. "This doesn't have to be the end of the expansion conversation." He left. She sat in the empty room and looked at the chair where Seth Crandall had never sat and thought about what Philip had said. "We'll find another path." It was the right thing to say. It was the kind of thing you said. She didn't know yet why it made her feel cold. She started digging that night. She'd always been good at research. Her father had called it her best quality, the willingness to go all the way to the bottom of a thing before she moved. She pulled everything available on Seth Crandall. Not much was public, which was itself information. He had no social presence, no press agent. The regional profile Tyler had found was one of only 4 substantial pieces she could locate, and 3 of them were about his properties, not about him. She read the 4th one twice. It was 3 years old, from a business journal in Asheville. The writer had noted that Crandall had spent a decade declining acquisition offers from companies 10 times Meridian's size. When the reporter asked why, he'd said, "I built these places by knowing who I was handing keys to. That's not a thing you can learn from a deck." She set her laptop aside. She looked at the ceiling of her home office and thought about a man standing in her lobby holding a gas station coffee cup, looking at the brickwork with genuine appreciation, looking at something she'd fought to keep. And she thought about herself, already moving, already managing the situation, already not asking. He'd known what he was there to find out. The question she was sitting with now was whether she understood what she'd shown him. She called Miriam Oakes the next morning at 8:15. The call rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She left a message, composed, professional. She said she hoped they could speak before the end of the week, that she understood the decision had been made, and that she wasn't calling to contest it. She was calling because she wanted to understand it. Miriam called back 19 minutes later. "Miss Calloway," she said, "thank you for returning my call." A pause. "I almost didn't." A beat. "What happened yesterday was not a small thing. I know that. Do you?" Miriam's voice wasn't unkind. It was the voice of someone who said difficult things often enough to have learned how to say them without flinching. "From where I sat, the CEO of a company trying to acquire someone's life's work didn't recognize the man she was meeting with and had him walked out through her own front door." Diane breathed carefully. "That's accurate. I made an assumption I had no basis for making, and I acted on it instead of asking a single question. It was wrong." Silence. "He comes without announcement," Miriam said, finally. "First meeting, always. No advance photo, no introduction from his side. He wants to see how a room treats someone who doesn't look like money. He's done this before, many times. Do most people fail?" Miriam was quiet for a moment. Most rooms make the same assessment you made in about the same amount of time. But Diane and Miriam paused before using her first name, deliberate. What he saw yesterday wasn't just Tyler doing his job. It was you. You were across the room. You came over personally. And you made the call yourself. Diane didn't say anything. "He told me afterward," Miriam continued, "that he watches the senior person, not the junior staff. He understands that young assistants are doing what they've been trained to do. He's looking for the person at the top of the room, whether they ask the question. And I didn't ask." "No." Miriam paused. "You turned away." The line was quiet. Somewhere outside Diane's window, a garbage truck was making its Tuesday rounds. "Is there anything," Diane said, "that can be done?" Miriam was quiet for a long moment. "He doesn't reopen things. That's not his pattern." She paused. "But he did ask me one question this morning." Diane waited. "He asked whether you called yourself or had someone call for you." Diane looked at her phone, at her own name in the outgoing call log. "I called," she said. "I know," Miriam said. "I told him that already." 3 days later, Bernard came to her office at 3 in the afternoon and closed the door. He only closed the door when the news was the kind that changed the shape of a room. He sat down. He put a single printed sheet on her desk. "Crestfield Ventures," he said, "approached us this morning about a co-acquisition partnership. They want to co-bid on the Harlow properties with us in a new structure. Diane looked at the paper. She looked at Bernard. She looked at the paper again. Who is Crestfield? They're registered in Delaware 18 months ago. 3 managing partners. Bernard paused. Their primary capital source runs through a holding entity called Aldine Capital Management. She looked up. Aldine is managed by a trust that lists Philip Greer as a co-beneficiary. The room went very still. Are you sure? I spent 2 days on this, I'm sure. She sat with it. She sat with the fact of it, the weight and the shape. Philip had pushed her toward the Crandall meeting for months. He'd made the introduction. He'd been the one standing in the lobby this morning when Tyler put his hand on Seth Crandall's arm. Handle it, he'd said. Not fix this. Handle it. And the morning after the deal collapsed, Crestfield had called. He'd set it up to fail, she said. Bernard looked at the window. He didn't contradict her. If we'd taken the Crandall deal on our own terms, Philip's Crestfield structure had nothing to offer. But if the deal collapsed and we were desperate, Bernard stopped. We'd take a co-bidder, she said, and the co-bidder is connected to him. Bernard nodded once. She looked at the printed sheet for a long time. Don't tell anyone, she said. Not yet. Already haven't. She thought all night. She sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad and rebuilt every conversation she'd had with Philip over the past 6 months, looking for the things she'd taken at face value. His enthusiasm for the Crandall meeting, his odd interest in the deal timeline, a dinner 2 months ago where he'd pivoted quickly when she'd mentioned restructuring the offer terms. She'd been grateful. She'd wanted someone in her corner. She'd taken the warmth and not examined it. That was the mistake, not the lobby. The lobby was where the mistake became visible. It had been building before that. She went to the Harlow property in Asheville. She didn't plan it exactly. She woke up Thursday morning and decided she needed to see the thing she'd almost acquired, and she booked a flight at 6:15, and she was there by noon. She rented a car and drove up the mountain road to the property, which sat at 4,200 feet, with a view that ran to 3 states on a clear day, and she stood in the parking lot for a few minutes before she went inside. The front desk attendant was a woman in her 60s named Bet, who treated every guest with the same unhurried care, regardless of how they were dressed or what car they'd arrived in. Diane noticed this. She noticed it because she was looking for it now, the way you looked for things after they'd cost you something. She wasn't there to pitch anyone. She didn't tell anyone who she was. She had lunch in the property's dining room alone, looking out at the mountains, and she thought about what Seth Crandall had built over 15 years and what it would mean to be the person he trusted with it. Her phone buzzed on the table. An unfamiliar number. She let it ring. It rang again 90 seconds later. Same number. She picked up. Miss Calloway, Seth Crandall said. I heard you were here. She set down her water glass. The dining room moved around her quietly. I wasn't here to negotiate anything, she said immediately. I just wanted to see it. A pause, I know. Bet called me. He was quiet for a moment. She said you tipped well and didn't take a call during lunch, which she considers the measure of character. Diane almost smiled. Your staff protects you. Everyone who works for me has worked for me for more than 10 years, he said. There's a reason for that. She knew what he meant. She understood what she was being shown. Can I ask you something? She said. You're already here. Go ahead. The lobby, she said. Tuesday morning. Did you make the decision in that moment, or had you already decided? A long pause. I'd been watching for a few minutes before you came over, he said. Your building is good. The brick detail near the entrance is original. The reception desk is reclaimed wood. Someone cared about that. He paused. I wanted to see if the person who cared about that was the same person who ran the meetings. She looked out at the mountains. I wasn't, she said. No, not that morning. He was quiet. Why did you come up here? She thought about the honest answer. Because I wanted to understand what I almost lost, and because I think something is wrong inside my company, and standing in that building was making it hard to see clearly. Silence. The mountains outside the window were doing what mountains did, being permanent, being indifferent. Tell me about what's wrong, Seth Crandall said. She told him not everything, she was careful, but the outline, Philip, the Crestfield approach, the timing. She told him about Bernard's 2 days of research and what it had produced. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, Philip Greer reached out to my office 4 weeks before our meeting, through an intermediary. He communicated that Meridian's acquisition structure would include a development partnership opportunity for a group he was affiliated with. He represented it as standard practice for your firm. She went very still. When I arrived Tuesday, he continued, I wasn't only there for the presentation. I was there to see whether what he'd told me was real, whether your company ran that way. And I walked you out the door, she said. You did. She looked at the table. She looked at the mountains. She thought about the right thing to say and couldn't find it, and so she said the true thing instead. I'm sorry, she said. Not the professional version, the real one. You built something worth trusting, and I came into that lobby, and I didn't ask your name. That's on me. Not on Tyler, on me. A long silence. Come back down the mountain, Seth Crandall said finally. I'll be at the property at 4. She was there at 3:58. He was sitting in one of the rocking chairs on the front porch of the main lodge when she pulled up, looking at the valley below, with the ease of someone who'd spent considerable time doing exactly this. He stood when she came up the steps. He was still wearing the flannel shirt, different one, same worn quality. They sat in 2 rocking chairs and talked for an hour. He told her the specifics about the intermediary, a man named Douglas Fitch, who ran a deal facilitation operation that Crandall had encountered twice before in situations that had the same shape as this one. An inside board member using outside channels to position a side arrangement that the CEO didn't know about. He'd recognized the pattern. He'd come to Tuesday's meeting specifically to see whether the CEO was part of the pattern or blind to it. She'd been blind to it. She sat with that. The rocking chair moved gently. The valley turned from gold to gray in the late afternoon light. What you do with this, he said, is your business. I want to be clear about that. I can tell you what I know. I'm not interested in being a player in your board fight. She understood. I'm not asking you to be. He nodded. What are you asking? She looked at the valley. If it comes to it, she said, and she measured her words, would you be willing to give a written account of the approach that was made? Not testimony, not a filing, just what you observed. He rocked for a moment. Douglas Fitch's name, the date, what was communicated, she said. That's all. He was quiet. I've already built most of what I need without it, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not asking you to carry this for me. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent to respect, the kind that wasn't given but registered. Get me a name for your attorney, he said. I'll have something to them by end of week. She let out a breath. She hadn't noticed she'd been holding it. They sat on the porch for a while longer without talking about anything in particular. He pointed out a hawk circling over the near ridge. She mentioned the stonework on the lodge's chimney, how it matched the texture of the mountain face behind it, and he said a local mason named Gerald had done it in 1987 and was still alive and still occasionally consulted when repairs were needed. She didn't know why that detail settled something in her, but it did. She drove back down the mountain in the early dark, and she thought about what she was going to have to do. Her attorney was a woman named Patricia Sandoval, who'd handled corporate litigation for 25 years and had the manner of someone who'd seen every variety of institutional betrayal and stopped being surprised by any of it a long time ago. Diane called her from the rental car. Patricia picked up on the second ring. Tell me, Patricia said. Diane talked for 11 minutes. When she stopped, the line was quiet for a moment. Then Patricia said, how solid is the financial documentation? My CFO built it. It's solid. The account from the seller, what you're calling the intermediary approach, that's external corroboration. If we can get it in writing, what you're describing meets the threshold for an emergency board disclosure and a motion for recusal. Patricia paused. Don't approach Greer. Don't give him any indication you're looking. Get me everything by Friday morning. She got back to the city at midnight. She was at her desk at 7. She pulled the board bylaws from the bottom drawer of her credenza, the binder her father had prepared when he handed her the keys, which he'd called the house rules. She read it for 2 hours. She took notes. She ate a bag of almonds she found in the same drawer and didn't notice they were stale until she'd finished them. Bernard came at 9 with 84 pages of compiled documentation. Advisory contracts, vendor arrangements, deal recommendations spanning 3 years, each one tied back through 2 or 3 steps to Philip's connected entities. He'd tabbed the relevant sections. His handwriting in the margins was small and careful. You've been at this all night, she said. It started to feel personal, he said simply. She worked through the afternoon. Her IT director, a quiet, meticulous woman named Rosa, pulled access logs from the internal financial system. She sent them at 4:15 with a single-line note. There are anomalies in the document access records going back 11 months. I can walk you through them if useful. Diane wrote back, my office, 7 a.m. tomorrow. Tell no one. Rosa wrote back one word, understood. The logs showed a pattern of document access from a contractor account, a consultant retained by the board 14 months ago, championed by the chairman, whose engagement Diane now realized she'd approved without examining who'd recommended it. She sat in her empty office at 10 p.m. and thought about the shape of what she was looking at. Philip had been inside this for at least a year, maybe more. He'd used his position and his access and the trust she'd extended him and built something that served himself at the cost of everything her father had spent 30 years building. She thought about that dinner, his enthusiasm. This is the one. This is what puts Meridian on the map. She'd been so grateful. She'd wanted it to be true. That was where it started, not in the lobby, before the lobby. Thursday, Philip called twice. The first call she let go to voicemail. His message was warm and solicitous and completely normal, which was the worst version of it. She could see through it now in a way she hadn't been able to before, and the seeing through was a different kind of loss. The loss of something she'd thought was real and had built herself around. The second call she answered, because 2 missed calls in one day would register, and she needed him to believe the temperature hadn't changed. "Diane," he said, "you've had a hell of a week. How are you holding up?" "Managing," she said. Her voice was even. "Tired enough to be credible." Terrible thing about Crandall, though I'll tell you, Crestfield Ventures has been in touch again. Their structure is actually quite flexible. More flexible than a straight acquisition would have been. I think there could be something interesting there. He was selling it, casually over the phone, the way you'd recommend a restaurant. 4 days after she'd discovered the wire connecting him to their primary backer. She gripped the edge of her desk. "I'm still reviewing it," she said. "Don't wait too long," he said. "These windows close. Have Patricia take a look before the week is out." "I will," she said. She hung up. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said quietly into the empty office, "You have no idea." Patricia had the written account from Seth Crandall's office by Friday at noon. 6 pages. Douglas Fitch, named by name, the date of approach, the terms communicated, the fact that the arrangement had been represented as standard Meridian practice. Patricia called at 12:19. "This changes the weight of what we're bringing," she said. The emergency board meeting was called for Monday at 10. Diane submitted the formal request Sunday evening, citing the emergency provision, listing Bernard and Patricia as supporting witnesses. She sent it to all 6 board members simultaneously. By 9 p.m. she had 4 confirmations. By 11:05. Phillips came in at 11:58, late enough to tell her he'd 2 hours deciding whether to appear. He appeared. She rode the elevator to the boardroom alone at 9:58 Monday morning. She thought about nothing specific. The thinking was done. The doing required a different part of her. The boardroom was the same room it had always been. Good light, long table, the city through the windows doing its Monday business. She set her documents at the head of the table, her chair, not Phillips. The room filled over the next 10 minutes. Board members, independent directors, general counsel, audit committee representative. Philip came in at 10:02 wearing a charcoal suit and the particular warmth he deployed for rooms he needed to manage. He looked at her at the head of the table, and something moved across his face quickly, gone before it was readable, and then the warmth came back. "Diane," he said, settling in. "Unusual Monday." "It is," she said. She began. She followed the sequence she'd worked out with Patricia. Timeline first, pattern before name. She walked the board through the access logs. She walked them through the contractor account, the 11 months of document pulls, the sensitivity analyses that had been routed to entities she now named. She watched the room, the audit committee rep leaning forward, the independent director to her, left going still in the way people went still when they understood what they were looking at. She did not look at Philip. She presented the advisory contracts, the vendor arrangements, a partnership negotiation from 18 months ago that had collapsed on Philip's recommendation when the numbers were sound and had been picked up by a connected firm 3 months later. She laid it out without adjectives. She let the date in his chair. She presented the Crestfield structure, the Delaware registration, the Aldine capital connection, the trust documentation. The general counsel stopped writing and looked at the table. "I'd like to address these points before," Philip began. "Under Article 7, Section 3 of the company's bylaws," she said, her voice level, "an emergency integrity disclosure may not be interrupted by motion until the disclosure is complete. I'd ask you to hold your response." She looked at him directly. "Thank you, Philip." The room was very quiet. She looked at him for exactly as long as it required to establish that she was not going to look away. Then she looked back at her documents and continued. She presented Seth Crandall's written account last. She introduced it as a voluntary statement from the seller in the failed Harlow acquisition, naming Douglas Fitch, the date of the intermediary approach, and the terms that had been communicated. Terms that had never appeared in any acquisition structure Diane had prepared or approved. She set the document down. She looked up at the room. The audit committee rep was looking at Philip, so were both independent directors. Philip looked at Diane. She'd been warned about this moment by Patricia. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across dozens of dinner tables and boardroom tables in 6 years. The collegial look, the I'm on your side look, the look she'd believed. She saw it clearly now for what it had always been, a management technique. She looked back and she did not look away. These are circumstantial connections presented by someone under significant professional pressure, he said. His voice was still good, still smooth. I've given this company 6 years. This board knows my commitment too. Margaret, Diane said, turning to the independent director on her right, would you read Article 11? Paragraph 2? Margaret read it. It was 13 words and left no room for interpretation. A documented pattern of conduct across 14 months, she said, with financial benefit accruing to a connected party through verified third-party corroboration, satisfies the burden for an independent audit under this provision. She looked at the full table. I'm not asking this board to reach a verdict. I'm asking you to authorize an independent audit of all advisory arrangements, vendor contracts, and deal recommendations involving our chairman over the past 3 years. And I'm moving under the emergency provision for Philip Greer's recusal from all board activities pending that audit's completion. Silence, the kind with weight. The kind that meant something had been said that changed the shape of the room permanently. Philip put both hands flat on the table. 6 years, he said. I have given this company. I think we should vote, said the independent director on her left. His name was Owen Marsh, and he was 68 years old and had been on the board since before her father's stroke. He was looking at Philip with an expression that had no warmth left in it. Philip looked at Owen. Something shifted in his face, not a collapse. More like a wall developing a crack, the structure still holding itself up but differently than before. I'd like to consult with counsel before any vote. You're welcome to do that after, Owen said. The vote took 6 minutes. 6 members present, 1 recusal. Philip cast his own vote against both motions, looking straight ahead, jaw set, the warmth entirely gone from his face now. The motion to authorize an independent audit passed 4-1. The motion for Philip's recusal passed 4-1. After the second vote, Philip stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Diane, and she looked back, and the room was absolutely quiet. You've made a significant mistake, he said. His voice was the one underneath the voice she'd heard for 6 years. Harder. Smaller. I don't believe I have, she said. He left. The door closed. She stood at the head of the table and felt the room reorganize itself around his absence. Board members who'd been rigid were releasing breath. The general counsel was already on his phone. Patricia was gathering documents with the focused efficiency of someone who had more work to do and no interest in marking the moment. Owen Marsh caught her eye from across the table. He didn't say anything. He gave her one slow nod, the kind that carried the weight of a sentence. She nodded back. She stayed at the table until the room had cleared. Then she sat down and put both hands flat on the surface and breathed. Outside, the city was the same city it had always been. She found that helpful. Things this large happened, and the city kept going, and the keeping going wasn't indifference. It was just the scale. Patricia came back and sat across from her. You held the room, she said. I held the room, Diane said. The audit will take time. He'll retain counsel. It will get public and messy before it gets clean. Patricia paused. The board will need consistent leadership through it. They'll have it. Patricia stood. Good. She left. Bernard stayed. He sat across from her with his compiled report in front of him and the expression she'd come to think of as his post-crisis face, hollowed out and steady at the same time. It's going to go public by Wednesday, he said. You'll want to get ahead of the communications, I know. She paused. Employees first. Before the press, before investors. The people in this building hear it from me before they read it anywhere else. Bernard nodded. Your father would have done it the same way. She looked at him. He didn't say things like that carelessly. He was not a sentimental man. The remark landed with the weight of something he'd been holding. Thank you, she said, for bringing this to me. For all of it. He nodded. He stood. He was at the door when she said his name. When this is behind us, I want to restructure the internal oversight process. Access controls, conflict reviews, vendor vetting. I want you to lead it. He looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said. He left. She sat in the empty boardroom for a long time after that. She looked at Philip's chair, pushed back at the angle a person left when they stood in a hurry. She thought about the chair she'd been arranging herself around for 6 years. His enthusiasm, his introductions, his pats on the table, the warmth she'd taken as given. She thought about what her father used to say about the room you thought you understood being the one most worth examining. She picked up her phone. She typed a message to Seth Crandall. Board voted. Audit authorized. He's recused. She looked at it for a moment, then added, I held the room. She put the phone down on the table and looked at the city through the glass. Her phone buzzed. 3 words from Seth Crandall. I know you did. She looked at it for a long time. She thought about a man in a flannel shirt looking at the brickwork in her lobby. She thought about a front desk woman named Bet who called her employer when a stranger tipped well and didn't take calls at lunch. She thought about a hawk circling over a mountain ridge, and a mason named Gerald who'd done the chimney work in 1987 and was still there when anyone needed him. She thought about what it meant to build something you were willing to protect for the long time. She set the phone face down. She had a company to run. The audit concluded 7 weeks later. The lead auditor, a careful, dispassionate woman who seemed genuinely interested in the facts and not at all in the drama, delivered the final report on a Wednesday morning. She walked Diane and Bernard and Patricia through it section by section without affect. It was worse than Diane had expected. Philip had been redirecting deal flow and confidential strategic information for the benefit of connected parties for not 2 years but closer to 4. The Harlow acquisition had been engineered to collapse specifically to create the Crestfield opening. 2 other acquisitions over the prior 3 years had followed a similar pattern, killed on his recommendation with sound numbers, then absorbed by connected entities within 6 months. 4 years. She sat with the number while the auditor talked. She'd taken the chair 6 years ago. Philip had been doing this for 4 of those 6 years, before the Harlow deal, before the Crestfield approach, before she'd understood what she was dealing with. She kept her face neutral. It wasn't the time for what she was feeling. She knew where to put it. The SEC referral was submitted Friday morning. By afternoon, it was on 4 sites. Diane did 1 statement and no interviews. 8 sentences. She said what needed to be said and nothing that didn't. The employees received a letter from her Tuesday afternoon, written herself without communications polish, in plain language. She told them the truth. She told them what had happened and what she'd done about it, and that the company was stable and she was not going anywhere. She ended by saying that the company her father had built was worth protecting, and they were the reason it was worth protecting. By end of business Tuesday, she had received 93 individual responses. Some were a single line. A handful came from people she'd worked alongside for years. Several came from junior staff whose names she barely knew. The recurring thing in them wasn't reassurance seeking. It was something more like relief. Like people who'd felt something wrong in the walls for longer than they'd been able to name, and had finally been told that what they'd felt was real, and someone had seen it. She kept those messages. She didn't delete them. The week the public story broke, Seth Crandall called on a Thursday afternoon. "I've been reading," he said. "I imagine so. How are you holding up?" "Better," she said. "Honestly. It's the in-between part now. Audit done, legal proceeding beginning. Long, but the shape of it is known. Known is easier than not. It is." A pause. "I've been thinking about the Harlow properties," he said. She was quiet. "I'm not ready to put them back into a process." He paused. "But I'd consider a conversation in about 6 months. When the board reconstitution is finished and the audit is fully in the public record." She understood what he was saying. He wanted to see the company after the crisis, not in it. He wanted to see the version of Meridian that existed on the other side of what she'd built. 6 months, she said. "I'll call you," he said. She set the phone down on her desk and looked at the city. The winter light was coming through the windows at the angle that made everything look more certain than it was, and she sat in it and thought about a man who'd walked into her lobby with a gas station coffee cup and let himself be shown the door, and what he'd been looking for when he did it. She'd failed the first test. She'd passed the one that mattered. She wasn't naive enough to call anything finished. The legal proceedings would run long. The board reconstitution would take 3 months at minimum. There would be days ahead that were harder than the day she'd stood at the head of that table. There would be rooms she hadn't anticipated yet, and mistakes she hadn't made yet, and the ongoing work of being responsible for something that mattered. But Philip was gone. The company was standing. The people who worked in that building still had jobs and a CEO who knew, now, exactly where the blind spots were and what it cost to leave them unexamined. She'd built that. With Bernard and Patricia and Rosa and Owen Marsh from the far end of the table, and from a careful distance, Seth Crandall, she'd built it. She pulled her legal pad toward her and wrote a name at the top of a fresh page. The name of the new independent director she'd been considering. She drew a line under it and started writing what the board needed to look like when this was done. Not filled back in. Built correctly, for the first time. She wrote for a long time. The city moved through its afternoon outside the glass. The light changed, the day went on. Outside, somewhere down the mountain, Gerald the Mason was probably still taking calls. She kept writing.